Chapter 216, Light and Thin. On Chinese New Year's Eve, everyone was full of wine and food, and they had to go outside the city to watch the fireworks. Zhang Xuning was a little confused. I roughly remembered what Yan Lin and Shen Zai had said to her, and she answered as usual, but when she turned around, she didn't remember anything. It wasn't until I was blown by the cold wind in the courtyard that I suddenly came to my senses. The feast was dispersed. Everyone went to see the fireworks. She excused herself from being sleepy and went up the hallway alone. But when I looked at it at this moment, I realized that this was not the way back to my house, but the way to Xie courtyard. The lanterns of the New Year's festival are full of excitement in the outer courtyard, but they are cold in this secluded place. The branches that had lost their leaves slanted horizontally along the hallway. The dim light fell at her feet, blurring her figure to the ground. Zhang Xuning really didn't want to think about it, but Shen Zai's words kept echoing in her ears during the banquet, lingering, and disturbing her. In the palace at that time. Who knows her birthday, and who has the ability to call the imperial dining room, and who can send a little eunuch to send a bowl of noodles into Yang Zi's eye without knowing it? Not the most likely one. Then, the person who has the ability but should not have the possibility becomes the only person who has the possibility. But how ridiculous is that? She stood still in the hallway, her fingers hanging at her side, trembling. In the past and present lives, all kinds of causes and experiences have been in my mind. For a while, Xie was smiling in the middle of the night palace ban, and the fluttering sentence Niang Niang is self-respecting, and at the same time, it was the early summer while reading hall, he grabbed her ruthlessly, and forbearance almost pleaded with the sentence Zhang Xuning, don't go. Suddenly, it was snowing again. It was he who grabbed her neck in the dark cave, and then in a flash, it was the golden step in the hair of cunning palace that fell to the ground, gradually stained by the pool of blood that meandered open. That pain, that cold, it was as if she had never left her because she had lived again. Zhang Xuning raised her hand and pressed the side of her neck hard. It was as if the surging blood had been cut by a sharp dagger, and if you didn't cover it tightly, there would be a gushing of blood flowing out, so painful, so painful. Even the scars brought by Yan Lin in her previous life, she hadn't forgotten it. How could she be willing to jump into another sword mountain and another sea of fire? From the moment of rebirth, something has been deeply imprinted. She was destined not to be able to completely shake off the past. Without those pasts, there would be no current Zhang Xuning. Even if she met in her previous life, it can be regarded as her self-blame and self-restraint, but in the end, he forced her to kill her. The things that flicker in my mind are still changing. Zhang Xuning almost arched her back in pain, bent down, only floated in her footsteps, stumbled and turned around, and wanted to find her way back to her room. Just 2 steps, but I think back to the day. Xie asked her how Shen Zai was worth her to do everything she could, and when she replied, His Royal Highness is very good to me, Xie eyes were silent and stared at her for a long time. I can't help but stop in the end. The feeling of suffering captured her, and made her feel an inextricable pain, and her patience was extreme, but it became a sudden determination to spring up. There are some things that she no longer wants in this life. Although it is said that he has lived for 2 lifetimes, the 2 lifetimes together have only been empty for 27 years, which is more than a year less than Xie in this life. Besides, how can she compare her wisdom with Xie talent? If you don't explain it and cut it off, you will be the one who suffers after all. Zhang Xuning stood in the cold silence for a long time, slowly clenched her fingers, and forcibly dispersed the tremor that climbed up, turned around again, and went to the end of the corridor. The shadows of the trees under the eaves are sparse. In the past, the sword book that was always guarding outside Xie door, tonight, I didn't know what it was to stand outside the courtyard with a sword, and when I saw her figure, I was already shocked. Second missing. Jiang Swining said, I have something to find, Mr. Jianshu was stunned for a moment, and subconsciously wanted to say something, but when he glanced at her, he didn't say it. There was a bit of an indescribable feeling in this look. But Jiang Swining pretended to be something, didn't think about it, and saw that although Jianshu didn't answer, he didn't stop him, so he walked straight in beside him, and only stopped in front of the closed door. There was not a single light in the room, it was pitch black, and there seemed to be a faint sound of water. She took a deep breath and knocked lightly. The sound of water suddenly stopped. Jiang Swining was stunned for a moment when she heard this, and still said, Mr. Xia, the student has something to ask. There was silence in the room. She almost thought that the little movement she had heard earlier was her own delusion, and Xia Wei might have fallen asleep. It was only a moment later that I heard the sound of booming water, which was much more obvious than Fang Yi. The closed door soon opened. Xia Wei came out of the icy water. He didn't even wipe the traces of water on his body, he only put on a pale green robe outside. Most of his hair was stained with water, and his face, neck, and Adam's apple were all dripping with water. He was shoeless and barefoot on the ground. The placket of the robe was spread out, and it did not look neat and tidy as before, and it went down the Adam's apple, even revealing a strong chest. The thin lips were pursed, the hands were on the edge of the door, and a pair of eyes looked at her, which made people feel a little thrilling. Although there was no light in the house, it was pitch black, but there were lamps hanging on the porch outside. As soon as the light shone, Jiang Swining could already see him clearly. At this time, it occurred to me that Xie Juan was actually bathing in the room just now. She immediately knew that this time was not good, so she hurriedly retracted her eyes, and didn't dare to look elsewhere at all, so she lowered her gaze and landed on her feet, and quickly said, the student is presumptuous, come back another day. After saying that, you have to retreat. Xie Wei grabbed her arm, imprisoned her firmly, and said, you're afraid of me like this. He was clearly immersed in cold water, and there was no heat on his body, but the palm of the palm that grabbed her arm transmitted an astonishing temperature, and it was trembling through a layer of soft silk. Jiang Swining felt that something was wrong. She barely kept her composure and said, I just had some unsolved confusion and wanted to ask Mr., but I drank 2 more glasses of wine during the banquet and fainted, and I actually came to disturb him late at night, and I hope Mr. will forgive me. Xie Wei heard that she was still so unfamiliar with her tone, and when he heard the word wine in her words, the corners of his eyes twitched slightly. The unhappiness accumulated from the time he left the banquet in the middle of the banquet to the present has finally accumulated to a peak, gushing out majestically, making him use the force in his hands, and directly drag the person into his arms, and bury his head in kissing. Jiang Swining's lips, which were soaked in water, froze so cold that Jiang Swining trembled. His wet arms were also stained with her water, but the chest that was clinging to her was actually tight and hot. Labial and lingual invasion. Hidden anger. There was no room for her to breathe, and the storm was generally overwhelming, revealing an unprecedented danger. This is especially true when I was trapped in a cave due to heavy snowfall. In addition to the deep anger, there is also a deep desire that makes people tremble. He tapped the tip of his tongue against her teeth, and bit her lip, causing her to snort in pain, and then he took advantage of the weakness, forcing her to raise her head to bear the deep kiss that almost suffocated her. When you get your lips parted, you only have the strength to breathe. Jiang Swining looked at his posture of not listening to half a sentence, and knew that something was wrong, and wanted to push him away, but he held him tighter. A sneer appeared on Xie Wei's lips. Now I know that I'm scared, I want to run. The courage to give me a drink without looking at it first. Jiang Swining panicked, and was simply confused. What wine? Xie Wei listened more and more heartbroken, and he didn't bother to explain to her, so he pulled her into the door without saying anything, struggling to escape. Jiang Xuning was so angry that she raised her hand and slapped him in the face, and there was a snap in the night, and she scolded coldly, "In the middle of the night, please respect yourself." Xie Wei was slapped slightly sideways by her. She turned around and was about to burst out the door. However, Xie Wei's eyes were cold. He was already one step ahead of her, grabbed her with both hands, and pressed the door shut with his backhand, and her water-stained body was like a wall, trapping her in the narrow gap between him and the door, looking down at her condescendingly. Self-respect. The room suddenly became darker. Only the light from the porch shone in vaguely through the window paper. His silhouette is also obscure. Jiang Xuning opened her mouth to speak. Xie Zhuan's hand had already climbed up along her thin waist, and he buried his head in his lips and pressed his lips to hers. The palms of his hands were cold, but his voice seemed to be whispering, "Jiang Xuning, saints also have tempers. Although he is forbidden to feast, he can be disturbed by 7 emotions and 6 desires, which is common to everyone." But he endured it patiently, and did not want evil thoughts to invade him. She brought a glass of wine tonight, which made him unclean. A bucket of cold water was submerged, but it had not been suppressed and relieved, and the anger was in full swing, and she still came to him to shake it, provoking him, and she didn't say a word, and it made her heart ache. At this time, how can you spare her? Xie Wei had a heart of punishment, but the closer she got to her, the warm fragrance of nephrite jade was like pouring oil on the fire, which made him a little out of control. Jiang Xuning's body is really sensitive. Was only touched twice by him, and he had lost most of his strength, and his heart was flustered, aggrieved, and a little dark fear rose, and a few low whimpers overflowed between his lips, and tears flowed from the corners of his eyes. The warm tears fell onto his fingers that were clutching her jaw. Xie Wei suppressed her movements and stopped. At this moment, I really can't say whether I have more pity or more anger, and almost the Bodhisattva has a heart attack and wants to let her go, but this body is still angry, and I am really annoyed that she hates her, and I don't want to spare her lightly. So he gritted his teeth, grabbed her waist, turned her around, faced outward, against the door, and pressed her tightly, but the kiss of her lips and tongue fell on her slightly cool ear. Jiang Xuning's legs trembled softly. If he hadn't been on the door like this, I'm afraid that he wouldn't even be able to stand steadily, let alone move. Xie Zhuan's voice was extremely hoarse, and he asked her fiercely, "Tell me, what do you want to ask me?" Jiang Xuning's fingers weakly picked at the Linghua pane, only to feel that something was burned on her waist and eyes, and she didn't dare to act rashly, but she recalled her intention this time in her mind, and finally said, "I want to ask Mr. to make a bowl of noodles." Landed on the lips of her ear and paused. However, the next moment, it turned into a bit of bloody gnawing, and landed on her white jade-like earlobe, which became even more intense than before, leaving a clear tooth mark, and went to the side of her slender neck. Foolish ghosts also have times when they are smart, but unfortunately, those who should be angry with you are already angry. Jiang Xuning couldn't see his expression, she could only hear his voice, and felt a hand that seemed to be squirming behind her. At first, she was confused and didn't notice it, but when the breath that spewed on her skin gradually became heavier and more chaotic, she suddenly understood something. There was a buzz in my head, and it suddenly went blank. She barely knew how time was passing in her confusion. It wasn't until a certain moment that he pressed up heavily, his forehead against the back of her neck, and bit the spine in the collar. She pulled back with a bit of force, and finally released some kind of breath, that she suddenly woke up and screamed tremblingly, "Xie Zhuan." However, Xie Wei had never done such a thing to anyone, and he knew that such an act was not unscrupulous, and when he was sober, he knew that he was embarrassed, so he opened the door before she had a seizure, pressed the back of her neck, and pushed her out, and his voice was hoarse, "Remember to change your clothes tomorrow." Then the door shut. Jiang Xuning, who was pushed out of the door, couldn't believe what Xie Wei had done to her, and she couldn't believe that this was the sage praised by that person. All kinds of shame that could not be concealed welled up, and it was already out of anger. Outside the door, she had long forgotten what she had meant in the first place, and she couldn't bear to kick towards the door, scolding, "How dare you! Despicable, shameless, and obscene." There was no movement behind the door. Xie Wei bent his legs, sat with his back against the crack in the door, and scolded Jiang Xuning twice. After a while, I heard her stomp her feet, as if she was afraid that it was late at night, afraid of being seen, and repeated the sentence obscene through gritted teeth, and then her steps were messy, and she ran away as if she were running away. He looked down and thought back to what he had done. Endured it a few times, but in the end it still couldn't hold back. There was a shock in his chest, and he laughed heavily. Chapter 217, Flaws. When Jiang Xuning went out, she didn't even dare to take a second look at the sword book standing outside, so she returned to the house while it was dark, and dragged off her dirty dress. I just lay in bed, and I didn't sleep for most of the night. The next day, the maid came in to wash up, and was a little surprised to see that her clothes were soaked in the basin of water. Jiang Xuning only said that she came back last night and drank too much, so she didn't pay attention and put her clothes away. Naturally, the maids didn't think much of it. After the war at the border passed, Yu Fangyan and Ren Weizi planned to leave Xinzhou one day. It's just a trip to the city, and there are some border passes at the border, so you might as well bring some back and do a business by the way. I came early in the morning to ask Jiang Xuning if I wanted to go to the market together and see the scenery in Guangzhou. Jiang Xuning was upset. Originally, I finally made up my mind last night, and I wanted to explain it to Xie Wei. If she hadn't woken up early in the morning and saw the dress soaked in the basin of water, and the faint tooth marks that still left marks on the side of her neck, she would have thought that she was so bold that she would have dared to dream like this. It's just that the plan is also disrupted. She knows Xie Wei's ability very well, and she also knows her situation. The longer she drags on, the more she will fall into a whirlpool and it will be difficult to get out. Yu Fangyan came to find her. She just let herself leave this general's mansion, which had become a little depressed for some reason, and went to the market to take a breath, take a break, and think about it by the way. So the two went out together. On the morning of the first day of the Lunar New Year after the holiday, the market is full of joy, and the shops are full of things and people who are going out to play. On the high city tower, Xie Wei and Lucien saw the situation of the camp outside the city from a distance, and then walked back. Although it was already the new year, the wind was still cold. It's just that when Lucien spoke, he felt that Xie Zhuan's mood didn't seem to be affected by the cold wind. His eyebrows were clear, and his attitude was sparse. Compared to the melting moon hanging high in the sky, it was like a faint wind floating in a catkin's pond. He looked behind him, but he didn't see Dayakan, and couldn't help but say, "I woke up early this morning and heard that Dayakan arrested a girl last night, trained her for a long time, and cried miserably. I heard that she would be locked up in prison for several days. What's wrong? What's wrong?" Xie Wei raised his eyebrows slightly. He glanced back at Lucien and said, "Dayakan has a remote temperament, and he likes to be more honest with others, so I guess we're to offend him. Lucien, can you answer a little more perfunctory? I believe you have ghosts." He simply didn't inquire, first glanced around, and saw that no one was nearby, so he spoke, "Now that the imperial court has sent Zhou Yanzi, it can be regarded as our army. What are you going to do?" Shenlang is really not bad at the emperor's mental skills. Although it is not used in the right way, it can be used on such a crooked path, and it is enough to deal with ordinary people. It's a pity that Xie Wei is not an ordinary person. He lowered his eyes and looked at the bricks of the city wall in front of him, stretched out his hand to touch the sword marks left by the years on his head, and said, "Now that he has come to recruit and the generals of Xinzhou City are more or less leading the troops, and it is not easy to raise the flag to rebel. It's not the best time. But, Lu Xiandao, do you have a move?" Xie Wei withdrew his hand, looked at the thin palm prints on his palm, and only said, "The heavenly sect hasn't made a move yet. Wan Ziozi has been planning for all these years, how can he not see the right time? The praying mantis catches the cicada, and the yellow finch is behind, this kind of thing can't be rushed." As he spoke, there was a sudden movement below. The two turned their heads to look, and it was Zhou Yinzi who walked up from below. The soldiers on both sides saluted him. But he saw Xie Wei and Lucien standing here at a glance, and after being stunned, he stepped forward. "Xiaoguan has seen young Master Xie. Yesterday was in a hurry, and it was a celebration banquet, but I didn't have time to get down to business. I don't want to be about to go to General Yanlin, this is where I met you." Xie Wei said, "Do you have something serious?" Zhou Yinzi's eyes flashed slightly, and he smiled when he looked at him. "I heard that Her Royal Highness the eldest princess has been rescued for more than a month, and her body needs to recuperate before, but now Her Royal Highness is well, and the Holy One means to take Her Royal Highness back to Beijing. And you and General Yanlin attacked the Tatars this time, rescued the princess, made the Tatars submit to our dynasty, weakened their strength, and avoided the disaster of war in the next few years at the border pass. The Ministry of Rights is already preparing even the sealed documents, but I don't know, when will you and General Yan leave? There are 100,000 soldiers at the border pass, and the capital is beyond the reach of the whip, but if you want to go back, you will be barehanded and enter the enemy's belly. Who would dare to take such a risk?" Xie Wei felt that Zhou Yinzi's words were more tentative, but he didn't panic, but first glanced around, and then looked at Zhou Yinzi. His voice was lowered, and he sighed lightly. "Lord Zhou, the court really spared this matter gently." Zhou Yinzi's expression suddenly froze a little. "Are you?" Xie Wei's face was a little cold. The Yan clan was investigated for colluding with the Pingnan Wang's rebellion, and they held a grudge against the saint and the court. It's a pity that it's too late, and the military power has already fallen into the hands of thieves. One is for self-preservation, the second is for the overall situation, and the third is for the people, so he made a false and wronged strategy, first to help him succeed, and then to get the news of the court. It's just that Master Zhou came alone, and he talked and laughed with him during the banquet yesterday, which is very puzzling. I don't know, what is the plan of the imperial court?" Lucien wanted to laugh when he heard it next to him. Zhou Yinzi never expected Xie Wei to make such a statement. After he arrived in Dexinzhou, he also inquired around, and almost preconceived that Xie Wei was also involved in the rebellion at the border pass. After all, with what he knew when he served Zhang Xuning in the past, and the fact that he had not had much contact with the DPRK and China in the past 2 years, he never dared to underestimate Xie Wei, and he was even more afraid of him than others. However, Xie Wei actually said that he and Yan Lin were false and wronged. Zhou Yin's heart turned rapidly, and he couldn't distinguish the truth from the fake for a while, but he also had ups and downs in Jinyue, and now he is a character, and he can talk about people when he sees people, but he knows how to talk about ghosts. Immediately, he smiled softly and bitterly. Only in a low tone, he said, "It turns out that the young master also has difficulties, so I thought, the Holy Lord regards you as a master and a right-hand man, should it not be so? It's just that as you said, the matter is a foregone conclusion, and it is really difficult to have a chance to reverse it, so it is better to make mistakes and see the situation. Or do you have something else?" Xie Wei's eyes narrowed, the brilliance flowed, he was silent for a long time, and shook his head. "The enemy is strong and I am weak, and there is no good plan." Zhou Yinzi continued, "The matter of returning to Beijing. Xie Wei glanced at the arrow tower built on top of the urn city on the inside of the city tower, and said, Yan Shai Zifang summoned the generals who led the troops in the city to discuss the matter in the arrow tower, but Xie was a civil official, so it was inconvenient for him to listen. Lord Zhou came just in time. Why don't you go and explore the wind first, and I'll make a plan later. Zhou Yunzi also looked at the arrow tower, but he couldn't help but groan. For Xie Wei's words, he didn't even dare to believe them. I am afraid that if I believe more, I will end up in a situation from which I will never recover, and I am even more afraid of falling into the trap of others, or accidentally revealing some secrets that should not be said, and incurring the disaster of killing myself. Lucien was like a mirror, so he naturally knew that none of Xie Wei's words were true, but he was just confusing Zhou Yunzi, and he felt that he was happy. But seeing Zhou Yunzi's words, he seemed to be afraid of the feeling of others on his side, so he moved himself and wanted to avoid the side. Unexpectedly, he took a step and saw the figure below. At that moment, he subconsciously blurted out, Miss Yu. Yu Fangyan was accompanying Zhang Xuning to see a local tea house in Xinzhou City, and had just bought 2 taels of tea and was about to go back to see if there was any difference between it and his own business. Where did he think that he would suddenly be called? The two of them followed the sound and looked up, and then they saw Lucien. By the way, I also saw Xie Wei and Zhou Yunzi on the city tower. Zhang Xuning was stunned. Xie Wei was also a little surprised, but when he saw Zhang Xuning, he also saw her new light blue pleated skirt today, and a fluffy scarf tied around her neck, blocking the slender neck tightly, and somehow, those things last night came to his mind. A rare discomfort stiffened him for a moment. After all, there is such a thing as self-blasphemy. Zhang Xuning looked at him. Although Xie Wei did not avoid his gaze, the tips of his ears were inevitably dyed with a suspicious red. It's just that the attention of others is below, and they don't pay attention to him. Zhou Yunzi saw Zhang Xuning and Yu Fangyan together. His eyes flashed slightly, and he took the initiative to talk to her. Second girl, is this busy business with Boss Yu? Zhang Xuning withdrew her gaze from staring at Xie Wei. Anyway, it wasn't her who did such a shameful thing, but she was extraordinarily calm, and even smiled on her lips, saying, Not really, it's just chopping. Having said that, it is naturally inconvenient to leave. What's more, she always had doubts about Zhou Yunzi. Since he met at this time, he said to Yu Fangyan that he wanted to go to the city tower. But Yu Fangyan shook her head, glanced at the person standing on the city tower, and said that she was waiting for her in the tea house on the side, and did not go up with Zhang Xuning. Zhang Xuning glanced at Lucien above, and her heart was clear. She didn't say anything, nodded, then took the corner of her skirt and walked down the steps below the city tower to the top of the city tower. Xie Wei didn't seem very comfortable and didn't speak. Lucien saw that Yu Fangyan didn't come up. He was a little unhappy, and he didn't speak. However, Zhou Yunzi was quite familiar with it, and greeted Zhang Xuning. Seeing that she was still carrying 2 taels of tea in her hand, she couldn't help but say, I'm afraid that the tea in Guangzhou is not as good as the capital. After all, the good ones are in Jiangnan or sent to the palace. Zhang Xuning's business shooting and hunting over the years have also been quite extensive, and in his early years, he was also in charge of the harem, and he knew how to pay tribute to the imperial court in various places. How could he not know this? It's just that Zhou Yunzi didn't have such an understanding of tea back then. I think that when she went to Zhou Yun's house, only the young lady was waiting alone, and carefully brewed the best tea in the house that was served to her, but it was just the first-class frozen top oolong that year. Zhang Xuning thought of her mother, and she couldn't help but think of Zhou Yunzi and Chen Chuyi's family affair, and couldn't help but say, Is your mother okay? Zhou Yun was stunned, as if she didn't expect her to ask about her mother. How did he know how well Zhang Xuning knew him? In his previous life, although Zhou Yunzi married Yao Shi, There were many concubines in the house, although the appearance of the young lady was not the best, and the favor was not the most prosperous, but it was the longest one in his back house. Later, Yao Shi disappeared inexplicably, although Jiang Xuning didn't care about Zhou Yin's private affairs, but she also heard some rumors about chasing the wind and shadows, saying that Yao Shi wanted to deal with his mother, and this happened. It was because she paid special attention to this handsome woman who had never met a few times. Zhou Yinzi was a little cautious. Why did you ask about her? Jiang Xuning said, just when I mention tea, I think of her, when I made tea for me in the old days, although the tea was not very good, but the craftsmanship of making tea was good. Now you will welcome Chen Chuyi into the door, don't wrong her, right? Zhou Yinzi was suddenly a little silent. After a while, she smiled. She was the daughter of a tea farmer in her early years, and she followed me in the middle of the family, and she really loves tea. Before I left Beijing to come to Xinzhou, the autumn tea in the palace had just been given, and she liked the red taste of Yunnan. The second girl cares, and I will convey it to her when I go back. Jiang Xuning suddenly raised her eyes and looked at him fixedly. The light in his eyes was too bright for a moment. Zhou Yinzi suddenly felt a little uneasy. Is there something wrong? However, this light in his eyes returned to normal in an instant. Jiang Xuning let out a casual "oh," and said with a smile, that's it, what do I have to ask about Lord Zhou's affairs? Zhou Yinzi hurriedly said, don't dare. Xie Wei had already seen them greeting for a long time beside him, and he sounded like old friends who hadn't seen him for a long time, and he was unhappy in his heart, so he interjected lukewarmly, Lord Zhou, if you don't leave, the discussion over there in the Arrow Tower should be over. Zhou Yinzi was taken aback, and he also heard that Xie Wei's words were a bit of a send-off, and immediately felt that something was coming, so he stopped talking to Jiang Xuning, bowed down and said, look at me, I almost forgot to get down to business. Then he took his leave first and saw General Yan go. After saying that, he saluted one by one, and walked along the winding city wall to the Arrow Tower in the distance. Jiang Xuning looked at his back, frowning. Xie Wei asked with a smile, are you very familiar with him? Jiang Xuning's heart was cold, and she said, Zhou Yinzi is not right. Xie Wei was stunned. Jiang Xuning was in a hurry, turned around, lowered her voice, looked at Xie Wei, and spoke quickly, Yunnan black tea is produced in Yunnan, and the autumn tea picking in the southwest is late, and the road is farther, and the tribute to the palace has always been in the middle of November every year, and the difference between the wind and snow is not more than 10 days. The emperor gave favor to his retainers, but it was only at the end of November and the beginning of December. He claimed that when he left for the border pass, the autumn tea in the palace was given, and the journey from the capital to Xinzhou was only 9 days and 10 days, so why did he delay until yesterday's Chinese New Year's Eve before entering Xinzhou? Xie Wei's pupils shrank slightly. Jiang Xuning said categorically, either he lied about the time of departure, but there was no need for this, or, during the missing time, he went to another place and had other plans. Chapter 218, The Old Day Knife. Xie Wei listened to the two of them just now, thinking that it was a reminiscence, but he didn't pay too much attention to it, but when he heard this, he frowned instantly, and almost immediately realized that there was indeed a small flaw in Zhou Yin's words. He looked at Lucien. Lucien also heard Jiang Xuning's words clearly just now. His heart was secretly shocked, his expression was a little solemn, and when he touched Xie Wei's gaze, he said, I will immediately make people check and hear clearly. Xie Wei added, let someone secretly follow his whereabouts, and the matter has not been clarified, don't let this person leave Xinzhou. Lucien said, yes. Now Zhou Yinzi's status in Jinyi Wei is second to none, and he has not been seen for more than half a month, and it is such a special time, and the involvement will not be small. He did not dare to delay, so he turned and went straight to the bottom of the castle tower to find someone to arrange all kinds of matters. Jiang Xuning also felt frightened, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt that this matter was inappropriate, and she didn't know what Zhou Yin's purpose was. But it's better to leave the land of right and wrong sooner. She didn't care about saying anything more, and turned to leave. Unexpectedly, Xie Wei's eyes were quick, and he actually grabbed her. His eyes fell on her, and he said, "You know the trivialities in the palace very well." Jiang Xuning's figure suddenly froze. In the palace all year round, large and small festivals have various state capitals to pay tribute, and the flowing water is never cut off, not to mention Xie Wei, who was mainly an official in the previous dynasty. Even the eunuchs in charge of the treasury in the Internal Affairs Office may not be able to know the details, and they have to turn over the records to be sure. But she just heard Zhou Yinzi's gossip, and immediately realized the flaw in it, and she was inevitably too sharp. If you don't know it by heart, how can you be so meticulous? She heard Zhou Yinzi's flaws. And Xie Wei heard her flaws. Jiang Xuning was grabbed by his wrist, stood still, looked back at him, but did not panic, only said, "Mr. Xie forgot, in the past 2 years, students have secretly operated the salt farm, but they are also involved in chamois silk cloth. When the spring and autumn new tea is picked in various places, how many cases are used as tribute, and what is the grade of the rest of the people, it is naturally known. Yunnan is in the southwest of Sichuan, not far away. Blame Zhou Yin's bad luck, I just happened to know what he mentioned." Xie Wei was non-committal, and he didn't know whether he believed it or not, but said, "When you were in the capital, Zhou Yinzi was originally your father's disciple, and then served you, so you can be regarded as your old department. But I see that you have just caught up with him, and you seem to be familiar with him, but in fact you don't trust him, and you are even very wary. However, once I was bitten by a snake for 10 years, I was afraid of the well rope." Jiang Xuning can't forget the tragedy of the previous life. If it weren't for the fact that there was no one available at that time, she would never have had anything to do with this person, and she would have avoided it, as if she was respectful of Xie Wei. She said, "It is precisely because of the acquaintance with Zhou Yin that I know this person's temperament very well. If a person's temperament can be easily moved, it is not called temperament. A ruthless and ferocious person, even if he is kind for a while, he will inevitably show his fangs in the future. Such people may be with them for a while, but they should not be for a long time, but not all the time, for a long time, for the sake of precaution." It was clearly Zhou Yinzi who said it, but Xie Wei felt that her words were implicit. The expression on his face gradually cooled. He locked his eyes on her and asked her, "So in your eyes, I am like Zhou Yinzi, which makes you afraid like a snake and scorpion?" Afraid of snakes and scorpions. No matter how powerful Zhou Yinzi is, he is just a bent welcome, bullying and flattering, and he is a two-faced villain. But Xie Wei is strong-willed, with great hatred and hatred, forbidden to go up and down, endure humiliation, and once the court is bloodied, he will be above tens of thousands of people. Is such a heroic figure, how can Zhou Yinzi be worthy of being on a par with him? If Zhou Yinzi is just a snake and scorpion, Xie Wei is the blazing sun in the sky. From a distance, it is acceptable, but it is close to the heart. Once the blazing sun falls from mid-air, it is no longer a light that shines on the earth, but a horror that destroys the world. In her previous life, when she was under house arrest and was bullied, she also had a glimmer of soft hope for this person. She thought, she had saved him. Even if she hasn't had much intersection for several years, she has joked about difficulties, but after all, they are all innocuous trivialities. If you beg him, you may be able to see the old kindness of feeding blood and administering medicine, and relieve her from fire and water. And yet nothing. It wasn't until later that she heard the speculation of Yu Fangyin in her previous life. It turned out that the son of Xiao Yan and the two clans of the previous dynasty was still alive in the world. Or maybe it's not someone else, it's the Emperor Xie Wei who has the power in his hands. Xie Zhuan turned out to be Yan Lin's brother. So why should he turn a blind eye to all the abuse she suffered? Adversity does not necessarily make people despair, but if even the last glimmer of hope is lost, how can we continue in a desperate situation? Although Zhang Xuning knows that this is a new life, although the people of the two worlds should not be equated, how can the same person's temperament be the same? Xie Wei is that Xie Wei. She never dared to have any hope for this person, and since he wanted to ask, she also announced all the words that she had not said yesterday. Mr. is ambitious, and he is a cloud in the sky, and a student is shallow and short-sighted, and he is mud in the ground. The finch is unknown, and the summer insect is incomprehensible. My husband and I are one in heaven and one in the earth, and we are not a good match. Ordinary people do their best to ask for the word Anshen, and please raise your noble hand. Raise your hand. When Xie Wei heard her words, it was like being poured with cold water, and even the blood that was originally boiling and flowing in the veins was cold. It turned out that it was not sweet for a moment, but the pain was piercing. Zhang Xuning didn't listen to his answer, and pulled the corners of her lips and smiled sarcastically. If Mr. can't let it go, why don't I sleep with you for 2 years, and then let me go when you are tired of it? If the words of the ancestors were just to stab him with a knife, the words at this moment are almost ripping out his heart. She deliberately provoked him with such words. His desires and affections are from the heart, so he let her be so cheap? The anger buried deep in his eyes finally surfaced, but he clenched his hand tighter, and Xie Wei said word by word, so what I wanted, its affection and nature, made you afraid, disgusted, and wanted to escape. He mentioned Zhang Xia again. This is not the first time. Zhang Xuning was very unhappy last time, and this time she was finally deeply angered by him, maybe because he crossed the line and offended her, maybe because the meaning of his words stung her. She instantly erected a sharp thorn all over her body, and refuted sharply, there is a bottomless abyss in front of you, you know that jumping down will break your bones, do you still want to jump down? Xie Wei said, how can you know if you don't jump? Zhang Xuning shouted, you are a madman to jump. Xie Wei sneered, you haven't understood yet, have you? Zhang Xuning only felt that the line of reason was getting tighter and tighter, almost pulling her to the same crazy demon situation as him, and fear made her struggle to retreat with all her might. Let go. What do I want to understand? What do I not understand? The corners of Xie Wei's eyes twitched slightly. At this time, I remembered what she had said, that there is a gap in the bottle of porcelain, but I felt that my heart was overturned like a river and a sea, and I would not go down no matter what. Anger swept over, and she didn't let go of half of her strength. Not only did she let people go, but dragged her all the way to the other end of the city tower. Zhang Xuning didn't want to leave and couldn't help himself, just thought he was completely insane. What are you doing? Xie Wei ignored it and continued as usual. Outside the city walls is a wilderness company camp, but inside the city walls are the market fireworks, and the peddlers are pawns. She was dragged forward by Xie Wei, and the two argued endlessly, but the soldiers passing by turned a deaf ear, all of them lowered their heads, and no one dared to follow to check half a point. Finally arrived at the east end of the castle tower. Below, there is a shop forging iron. In the tiled hut were several stoves, large and small, with charcoal burning in them. In the cold winter, the blacksmith in the middle of it was only short brown, and some were even shirtless, and he was hammering the red-hot iron embryo vigorously, and the splashing sparks, the red iron, and even the molten iron slurry on the top all exuded amazing heat. Xie Wei pointed downward, I think I am a piece of porcelain, and if it is broken, it cannot be bridged. Zhang Xuning, who do you think you are, and are you qualified to be that piece of porcelain? You and I are just iron slurry tumbling in this oven. Jiang Xuning was pinched by him and looked at it. Xie Wei's cold voice was sharp and cold, pouring into her ears like thunder. I know your life experience, and you know what happened to me. God didn't give you and me a chance to be a weak waste. You have to suffer 1,000 kinds of torture, all kinds of hammering, before you can become a form. There is a gap in the plum bottle that cannot be bridged, but if you are born only worthy of being a piece of iron, you should know that you are not so fragile. Even if you are broken by someone, you will have to re-enter the furnace to shed blood and endure humiliation, and cast into a new appearance. Jiang Xuning's eyes were suddenly full of tears. But Xie Wei held her tightly, still urging word by word, who loves you, who values you, and who needs you. If you want to be happy, how can you be happy if you don't have pain? You just want to be happy everywhere and avoid its pain. What is the difference between your life and those snakes, insects, rats and ants in the gutters and rotten ditches? Jiang Xuning was only tortured by Ling Qi, and his words cut open the skin, revealing bloody muscles and bones, and her whole body was trembling. How can a person in the world be as dangerous as you? I am not you. He was still cold. That's why a coward like you can't be with Jiang. Either he sees through you, or he's as stupid as you. Her eyes reddened. Shut up. Xie Wei said, it hurts. Jiang Xuning stepped back. You just won't let me go. Xie Wei was only pierced by her resistance and fear, but the more she did this, the more she did not show weakness, and the more she aroused the deep anger. You can run away and go to the ends of the earth. She almost screamed, are you crazy and want to drag others to accompany you to the funeral? Xie Wei was furious. What about the funeral? Jiang Xuning suddenly felt that he was hopeless. Xie Juan, things in the world can have results if they are not forced, they just torture each other. But Xie Wei refused to realize, bitter fruit is also fruit. Bitter fruit is also fruit. What a saying, bitter fruit is also fruit. Ever since she was trapped in the mountains for the snow last time, she had been aware of the darkness and anger under the skin of Xie Wei, a saint, but she didn't expect that his paranoia, madness, and terror had reached such a point. The string of reason in my mind finally collapsed. Jiang Xuning's thousands of emotions piled up in her heart, connected with the respect and awe of this life, the resentment and hatred of the previous life, all rushed out, and she couldn't restrain herself. Didn't even go through my head. At this moment, her eyes were red, and she asked him sharply, what if you killed me? The cold wind on the castle tower was blowing, and the flags planted high were agitated in the wind. Xie Wei stood opposite her. Jiang Xuning thought that she could bury a lot of things deeply, but the moment the words came out, she actually felt a despicable, almost revengeful pleasure, and she didn't even have a trace of regret, as if she should have done this a long time ago. Xie Wei looked at her, dazed for a moment, and did not speak. He thought, he should ask why. However, looking at her reddened eyes, and the strong resentment, he didn't ask. Far from dissipating from the depths of his eyes, the madness grew stronger. Xie Wei pursed his lips tightly, buried his head in his wrist and untied the short knife he carried with him, and handed it to her. He only said to her, come, kill me. Jiang Xuning's fingers touched the handle of the knife, and the residual warmth on it could not drive away the cold on her body. All the emotions in his eyes suddenly faded. At that moment, she grabbed the knife he handed and actually stabbed him. The sharp blade sank into the flesh and blood that was close at hand. Blood immediately poured out of his abdomen. Xie Wei's snow-white robe was stained. Jiang Xuning let go. He almost curled up in pain, but he covered the wound of the knife, but he still looked at her, and reached out like a drowning man trying to grasp a straw to keep her. Ning er. Jiang Xuning blinked, and tears flowed down. Xie Wan, you are really pitiful. Xie Wei couldn't catch her in the end. As if in a big dream, she forgot to wipe her tears, but turned around and walked downstairs. Chapter 219, Huigan. Dayakan had just finished picking up the girl who dared to drug the wine without knowing the height of the sky, and returned to the gate of the courtyard, and was bumping into Lucien, who was twisting his eyebrows and coming back to tell the matter, and before he could say a word, he suddenly heard a commotion outside. What about Zhou Qiwang? This is clearly the voice of the sword book, but it has lost its composure, and it has added a little panic in addition to its fierceness. Dayakan and Lucien were stunned. Both of them had a bad premonition in their hearts. When he stepped forward to look, he saw a large cloud of blood on Xie Wei's abdomen, and his face was already bloodless. Jianshu and a soldier supported him, and a group of people surrounded him left and right, gossiping, flustered and at a loss. Lucien was stunned. Dayakan almost didn't even hold the knife in his arms, and immediately stepped forward after being stunned, scolded the idle people around him, and helped the person to lie down in the house, and said, "What's the matter?" Jianshu didn't speak, and hurriedly went to the medicine box. Lucien said, "Wasn't I okay when I left? What happened? Who did it? Did people catch me?" Xie Weiren was not in a coma, but his heart was in pain, his forehead was covered with cold sweat, and he couldn't speak. The knife and harp force the person to lie down so that the wound will bleed as little as possible. It's just that he didn't hear the sword book's answer, and he was rarely anxious. Didn't you follow? Talk. What does the sword book dare to say? When he heard the movement and turned his head to look, he only saw Zhang swinning with blood on his hands, and walked past the front with an expressionless face, and when he rushed to the other end of the city gate tower, the gentleman had already fallen. And gave him 100 dares, and he did not dare to speak much. Dayakan still needs to be asked. Lucien's eyelids jumped, he saw a clue, pressed him, and shook his head gently. Dayakan was stunned, and suddenly thought of something, and closed his mouth. As early as when people had not yet entered the mansion, some people had already rushed forward to spread the word that Zhou Qiwang had only come to the border a few days ago, and he had helped the army deal with the injuries of some wounded soldiers, and he was suffering from uselessness. I didn't think that this war was over, but I spread it to him in a hurry. He came here wondering who he was going to cure this time. But when he entered the room, when he saw Xie Wei who was covered in blood, he almost threw away the medical box in fright, and hurriedly came up to check the wound. What is going on? The assassin is here. Lucien frowned. Look at the wound. Zhou Qiwang checked it, his heart was fixed, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Don't panic, it's not a big problem. The narrow blade knife is fast, but not deep, and the blade is not completely gone, as if it is merciful to his subordinates. The knife edge is not big, and it does not hurt the vital point, that is, it bleeds a lot, or it will die. Xie Wei's lips turned blue. Zhou Qiwang pressed the edge of the wound with his ruthless hand, and picked up the sword book next to him. The second layer in my medical box, take out the hemp boiling and give it to Mr. and the wine. The sword book didn't say a word, and did so. Ma boiling powder took it out of the medical box, and served it to Xie Wei with wine. It took a while for the potion to dissipate. Zhou Qiwang felt that Xie Wei was no longer trembling, so he dipped the soju on the side and wiped and cleaned the wound. At this point, the pain becomes dull. Xie Wei finally had the strength to speak. However, gritting his teeth and opening his mouth, he said to the sword and the sword, Ning Er, go, find Ning Er. Dayakan, Jianshu were stunned. Xie Wei threw Fang Ci's wine bowl on the ground, and his anger grew. Go. Lucien only felt his heart pounding. Jianshu and Dayakan glanced at each other. In the end, it was Dayakan who suddenly got up and said, I'll go and find it. He went out of the hospital, grabbed the people who came back and asked, Have you seen Miss Ning Er? Most people shook their heads. Someone said, I saw second Miss Ning talking with the young master on the city tower together. Dayakan went all the way out of the house. He originally thought that since Mr. asked him to find Ning Er's traces, then Ning Er's girl might not be gone, so he wanted to check from the city tower and send a few more people out to investigate. Unexpectedly, before I left the house, I bumped into the old housekeeper. Seeing him in a hurry, the other party couldn't help asking, "Where is Dayakan Gongza?" Dayakan also said casually, "Go find Miss Ning Er." The old housekeeper was suddenly surprised, and said, "Didn't second Miss Ning go back to the house earlier? I just saw people walking into the eastern courtyard from a distance." Dayakan was stunned. "What?" The old housekeeper didn't know why. Dayakan didn't care to explain more, so he turned around and walked to the east courtyard without saying a word. He knew where Jiang Swining lived. Walking all the way, there were maids holding tea and fruit plates, talking and laughing, and walking towards the courtyard. Dayakan followed him in, and only then did he see Jiang Swining. She went back to the general's mansion as if she was fine, washed the blood on her hands, and called Yu Fangyin to come to Shen Ziyi's house to accompany her to relieve her boredom. The three of them set up a square table, lit a stove, and gathered table leaf cards under the window. "I've already played several laps by now." Yu Fangyin was waiting for her in the tea house just now, and when she saw her go down the city tower with blood on her hands, she almost screamed in horror. "I followed her all the way back, but I didn't dare to ask half a sentence." At this time, she was playing cards with her, and she just didn't see anything, only grabbed the cards in her hand, and wrung her eyebrows to think about which one to play. Shen Ziyi didn't know what was going on outside, so she didn't pay attention to take a good hand of cards, and asked with a smile, "Have you two been shopping on the street?" Ning Ning didn't say that she was going to leave 2 days ago, and she didn't hurry up to prepare some itinerary, and she came to play cards with me. Jiang Swining said, "Doesn't this make His Highness panic?" With that, she threw a card out. Yu Fangyin looked at it and didn't eat it. Shen Ziyi glanced at her card, immediately smiled, put down one just to suppress, and said, "Then when will you leave?" Jiang Swining has always played cards to play these cards in her own hands, and she doesn't like to count other people's cards, so she let her pass with a little hand, and only replied, "Don't go." Yu Fangyin looked at her suddenly. Shen Ziyi was also stunned. "What's wrong?" Jiang Swining looked tired, but she didn't seem to be too lazy to mention it. "People don't have faces, trees don't want bark, no matter what, they are alive. My arms can't twist my thighs, and it's not like I'm kneeling. Comfort yourself, and accumulate virtue and do good. Let's live casually. I'm cowardly, and I don't have the courage to seek death and life." How perceptive is Shen Ziyi? Almost immediately, I realized something I didn't know. It's just that she didn't seem to want to mention Jiang Swining, and after thinking about it, she didn't ask any questions, but said, "Just don't wrong yourself." A round of cards played here is also clear. Yu Fangyin lost a lot. Jiang Swining is neither losing nor winning, but when she looked at the cards she put down in her hand, she couldn't help but say, "I don't play the cards in my hand, I refuse to eat mine. You are so kind and easy to bully, and you don't know how to do business in the past 2 years." Yu Fangyin only pursed her lips and smiled at her shyly. Jiang Swining was happy. Shen Ziyi covered her lips with the cards and smiled, generously accepted the silver on the table, and joked, "That's my luck, I became the big winner in the end by mistake." "You're welcome." Originally, it was to accompany her to relieve her boredom and make her happy, but no one paid attention to this bit of silver. Jiang Swining only laughed. However, when he raised his eyes, he saw the knife and chain coming in from outside, so he raised his eyebrows slightly, and asked as usual, "Your husband has been saved, is he not dead?" Dayakan was really confused, and subconsciously replied, The doctor said that it is no big deal, and he is being treated. Jiang Xuning put the card away. It's really big. Dayakan was in a fog. Sir, let me come to you. Jiang Xuning lazily, isn't this a finding? Go back, but be careful to tell your husband not to be so annoying, and if you go back and stab someone again, maybe it won't be so easy. Dayakan felt that he understood this. But when I think about it, I don't seem to understand anything. He looked at Jiang Xuning's demeanor and tone, and thought about his own husband just like that, but he didn't dare to ask anything, and when he saw that someone was there, he said yes, bowed down, and really withdrew. In Xie Wei's room, most of the wounds have been taken care of. Most of the basin was carried out with blood-stained water. Zhou Qiwang's forehead was sweating. Lu Xian watched for a long time, and saw that Xie Wei's situation had improved a lot, before he asked, "It's so good, how can you move the knife?" Xie Wei's thin lips were pursed, his eyes were closed, and he didn't speak. Lu Xian said, "You forced it?" He couldn't imagine that Jiang Xuning had such a hard personality on the outside and soft on the inside, and he could be ruthless enough to give him a knife. How much this person owes his mouth, and how desperate he has to do things. Xie Wei remained silent. Jiang Xuaningbo looked forward to that bit of freedom and wanted to leave, but he refused to let her go. The blame is self-inflicted. Then I asked him 1,000 times, 10,000 times, and he still answered the same question. Dayakan came back at this time. Lu Xian looked over. Xie Wei quietly clenched his hands and asked, "What about people?" Dayakan opened his mouth. He really didn't know what to say, and paused for a moment before saying, "At Her Royal Highness the eldest princess." Xie Wei was suddenly stunned. She didn't leave. Dayakan shook his head. "I didn't leave." Endured it, but he couldn't hold back, but he still added, "It's like someone who has nothing to do, pull boss you and Her Royal Highness the princess, and sit in the room to play leaf cards together." Lu Xian almost didn't squirt out a sip of tea. Xie Wei couldn't hear anything. She didn't go. Holding that hand, his face was a little dazed, and he finally slowly leaned back on the pillow behind him, and his body that had been tense relaxed little by little. At the end, I couldn't hold back, and the curvature of the corners of my lips opened wider and wider. The light of heaven reflected his pale face, almost bloodless. But Xie Wei actually laughed. At that moment, it was as if all the suffering had left him, and the clouds had been removed, the fog had been dispelled, and the light had been seen. Lu Xian even tasted a little bitter aftertaste from this smile, and felt deeply confused. But seeing him like this, he felt for the first time, Xie Zhuan seems to be a real living person. Chapter 220, Apricot Blossom Early. Xie Wei's injury really caused a shock in Xinzhou City. Fortunately, at the time of the incident, there were not many people on the city gate tower, and not many people witnessed it with their own eyes. The few who saw the beginning and the end were secretly gag and file, but they didn't dare to spread it out. Is based on the rumors related to the second missing, that is, a very small number of people know. Most of them were assassins. And within 2 days, it was spread with noses and eyes. In addition to committing murder in broad daylight, the words of flying eaves and walking on walls, picking leaves and hurting people have all been said, and some people swear that this must be the defeat of the Tatar side, and it is difficult to get out of a bad breath, so they specially sent someone to assassinate young Master Xie to vent their cruelty. If you don't say, how can you be a Tatar? Although he knelt down and begged us to make peace, he was still unwilling in his heart. General Yan is a strong martial artist, often in the army, and is a hard stubble. They can't afford to be provoked left and right, but isn't it easier for the young master to do it? He was born in the imperial examination, but he is a weak scholar, how can he resist the assassins? But God forbid, he has long eyes, and he doesn't let him have an accident, and it will be difficult to succeed in the future. In the tea shed downstairs of the city gate, a few chatting tea guests spoke, and it was like spittle, and the people who spoke danced and listened attentively. Weak scholars. Zhang Swining, who was sitting in the corner of the tea shed, listened to it, and only laughed silently. When Tong Zhou encircled and suppressed the heavenly sect, the scene of Xie Zhuan shooting an arrow through Xiao Dingfei's shoulder from afar is still vivid. If you want to say that he is a weak scholar, I am afraid that Xiao Dingfei, who has suffered hardships, will be the first to jump up and break this person's dog's head. But in the end, the so-called assassination of Xie Wei was done by herself, and she didn't go out to explain anything, just picked up the teapot next to her, added half a cup of tea to herself, and then looked diagonally to the opposite side. She's in the market these days. Originally, it was just a stroll, but Xinzhou City is such a big place, and it always walks to the bottom of the city gate. That day, Xie Wei dragged her down from the top of the city gate tower, and the blacksmith shop was next to it. It is about the beginning of spring, and it will not be long before things in the fields will be busy, and there seems to be a lot of business to make farm tools, and the shop is quite busy. The master with a gray beard was frowning and saying something to the little apprentice below. One moment pointing to the stove, the other to the stove. Blacksmith Joe is one of the few old blacksmiths in Xinzhou City. After all, the town is not big, and the people come to him for any need, but people from near and far know him. It's just that the specific name is, everyone can't tell. The only thing that is easy to remember is that this person is old, surnamed Joe, so in order to save trouble, they are all called Blacksmith Joe, or Master Joe. The blacksmith shop is engaged in ironsmithing, which is also a business, but with the word faithfulness. Whatever plowshares he has made with him, and when they have been brought back, they cannot turn the earth, or if they cut corners and weigh their deficiencies, they may bring them to him. Over the years, there have been almost no mistakes, and it can be regarded as second to none in the industry of Xinzhou City. So Blacksmith Joe is very popular in the neighborhood. Like the guy at the tea shop next door, he brought them some tea from time to time. After all, it's hot in the blacksmith shop, and I sweat in the winter, so I can't bear it if I don't drink a little more. It's just that today's guy made another trip to make them a few pots of tea, but Blacksmith Joe's eyes couldn't help but fall on the girl sitting in the corner of the tea shop. The snow-white Liuxian skirt has a circle of dark blue moire on the collar and cuffs, and the outer head is covered with a thin layer of primrose-colored crepe, and it doesn't draw eyebrows and eyes. If he's not mistaken, this girl has been sitting there for 2 days, hasn't she? If there was something to say, he would not have gone into the blacksmith's shop while sitting there, but if there had been nothing to say, he had always seen her looking toward the red-hot fire when he came out these afternoons. It's just that in the twilight, she's gone. The afternoon of the next day was as usual, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. Not only Blacksmith Joe, but also many young and strong guys and apprentices in the shop also saw it, but the girl was too good-looking, and they only dared to occasionally sneak a look and discuss it in private, but no one dared to come up and talk about it. Today's sun is gradually slanting. A few apricot trees planted next to the blacksmith's shop had already budded, and even a few of them were blooming on the branches. The pink and white petals are stained with a layer of twilight cast by the sky, which is very beautiful. There are fewer pedestrians in the market. The tea drinkers laughing in the tea shop soon walked away. The girl should be gone, too. The blacksmith thought for a moment, and after drinking tea, he rolled up his sleeves and tied them tightly around his arms, and took out the red-hot sword embryo that had been inserted in the coals, picked up the hammer and struck it vigorously one after another. It wasn't until every place was beaten evenly, picked up, and weighed, that he stopped to wipe his sweat and rested for a while. But I didn't think about it, but when I looked up, I saw that the girl had walked to the edge of the almond tree that had bloomed early. Blacksmith Joe couldn't help but be surprised, he clearly didn't recognize her, but at this moment he subconsciously said, "Spring is late in the north, but the blacksmith shop is hot all the year round, and this flower and tree often bloom earlier than other places, every year." Jiang Swining was slightly stunned. "Really?" Blacksmith Joe said, "I see that the girl seems to have been sitting outside for a few days, only watching the iron in the shop, and not coming in, but what difficulties have she encountered?" "Difficulty? It doesn't count. She just calmed down and tried to sort out her thoughts, and every time she walked here, she sat unconsciously for an afternoon." Jiang Swining shook her head lightly. "You're worried, it's not difficult. But when I went out for a walk, I saw that the blacksmith shop was always in full swing, and the beating was tinkling, and it seemed that your sword had been beaten for several days, but it didn't come to fruition, and I didn't pay attention to it for too long." Blacksmith Joe glanced at the sword embryo and laughed. He touched the beard on his chin, and when he talked about his old job, he had a bit of a strong spirit, and said, "100 steel, originally the mine came out of the mountains and burned once, that is, pig iron. It is about to be burned red like this, tempered thousands of times, to remove its impurities, in order to obtain its purity, and strong and tough, blowing hair and cutting gold and jade. What's more, all steel making was in the early years, and now all iron slurry is smelted, and all the finest tools must be forged by 10,000 forging. 10 days and a half months can be completed, that is less. 100 steel, 10,000 sword." Jiang Swining's eyes fell on the high furnace behind the blacksmith Joe for smelting iron slurry. His eyes flowed, and he only said, "It's really not easy." Blacksmith Joe smiled. "Where can this be easy?" As he spoke, he bent down and pulled the bellows under his head hard, and the fire in the stove suddenly became a lot stronger. He didn't raise his head and said, "There are still 3 calamities and 5 tribulations in human life, how can the sword be spared?" Jiang Swining listened, raised her eyes gently, and only looked at the branch that had bloomed with pink petals. When the blacksmith was done, he got up and saw it, and couldn't help but say, "If the girl likes it, pick a branch." Jiang Swining stood still and didn't move. Blacksmith Joe May's eyes were mixed with a bit of the peacefulness that only older people have, and he only said, "My youngest granddaughter sees this apricot blooming early every year, and she has to fold 2 branches and go back to play, don't worry." Jiang Swining did have some love for this apricot blossom that bloomed very early, and when she heard Blacksmith Joe say this, she also smiled, stood on tiptoe slightly, and only picked a small branch on the side that was only a little longer than a palm, and then bowed her head. "Thank you, master." A dozen or so apricot blossoms are piled up in 3 clusters on the branches. Many of them have already opened, and some of them are still shyly holding buds, held by her slender and white fingers, which is very beautiful. Blacksmith Joe frowned and smiled, and waved his hand again and again. "It shouldn't be a flower." As he spoke, he saw that the sun was about to set outside, so he pointed to the sky. "It's late this day, isn't the girl going home yet? No matter how big the matter is, how big can it be, go home and sleep the next day." Jiang Swining smiled and didn't say much. It was indeed not early, and she thought that it was time to go back, so she said goodbye to Blacksmith Joe. The sun is setting in the west, and the market is empty. Jiang Swining went far. Blacksmith Joe looked under the tiled shed for a while, only to see that the girl walked away with her hands behind her back for some time, and the apricot blossom pine hung loosely between her fingers, as if she was a little peaceful and transparent with what she encountered. Asterisk. When Jiang Swining returned to the general's mansion, she happened to encounter a few horses running from the side door, splashing some smoke and dust, but the first rider seemed to see her and actually reined in at the gate of the mansion. Yan Lingao sat on his horse. He was dressed in a dark color suit, but he was very sparse and neat, but when he looked at Jiang Swining, his brows were slightly frowned, as if he had a lot to say. but he was no longer the young man who talked nonsense in the old days, so he was silent for a while. These days, she has been wandering outside all day long, and she doesn't meet much with the people who live in the house, not to mention that Yanlin goes out early and returns late in the camp, so naturally she doesn't even have a chance to take a picture. I'm afraid that Yanlin will also ponder Xie injury. Jiang Xuning seemed to see his silence, and opened his mouth with a smile first. Are you going to the big camp again? Yanlin is not an outsider. Although he did not witness what happened on the tower of the city gate that day, he knew a rough idea. Seeing that she is like a person who has nothing to do at the moment, it is difficult to speak if she has anything to say. I wanted to speak for a long time. He felt that it was useless to say anything else, so he only said to her, Ning Ning, I'm on your side. Jiang Xuning was slightly stunned, and only laughed after a while, but did not take his words as a joke, but replied seriously, okay. Yanlin then hit the horse again and left. The rest of the people quickly followed. The horses soon disappeared at the end of the street. Jiang Xuning just entered the house, but halfway through, she saw a deserted corridor, stopped for a long time, and still went along this corridor. In the courtyard in a secluded place, there are few people waiting. She entered the courtyard and stopped under the eaves, and the sword book that had just come out of the house with an empty medicine bowl saw her and was stunned. The door had not yet had time to close. You can see from inside the door. Perhaps from the stagnant figure and demeanor of the sword book, the people in the room paused, and actually said to the window, Don't you come in. Jiang Xuning heard his voice and knew that he was saying this to himself, but said, No, I just came to ask Zhou Yinzi about it today. How is the investigation? Xie Wei said through the window, There is no news yet. Jiang Xuning gently closed her eyes, suppressed the little boredom that came out of her heart, and said, I don't feel at ease about this person. After thinking about it, leaving him to walk around in Xinzhou is a disaster. It is better not to do two things endlessly, and first arrest and lock people up, lest he be bad. When it is found out in the future, if he is innocent, he will be released again. Xie Wei coughed lightly. Aren't you afraid that he will be angry? Jiang Xuning said, What kind of grievances can the grass on the wall have? He knows the times very well, not to. Xie Wei then said, Then hand over the knife and piano to do it. Jiang Xuning nodded, stood for a moment, thought of nothing else, and turned around to leave. Xie Wei suddenly asked, Will you come tomorrow? Jiang Xuning stopped again, lowered her eyes and glanced at the small branch of apricot blossom between her fingers, and said, Tomorrow I will send Fang Yin and Ren Weizi to leave Xinzhou. Some are busy, let's do it another day. Xie Wei said, Then another day. Jiang Xuning's voice was no different from ordinary when he heard him, but the bitter smell of herbs couldn't help but float in this courtyard, which made people's noses and tongues slightly astringent. Then my mind flowed, and I remembered that day again. She slowly turned the apricot blossom around and said, I'm afraid you're right, I'm no different from the mediocre and ordinary people in the world. It's just that there are hundreds of people in the world. Some people like a person, and they must do everything possible to be with someone. But there are also people who like a person, or they just want the other party to be safe and smooth, and they may not necessarily ask for a result. There is no difference between these two kinds of people. To me, Zhang Shaji is charcoal in the snow, a dark room lamp, and a boat. Even if it is going to be once wanted, I don't want to hear anyone slander his words. Xiejuan, don't mention him again in the future, okay? Jianshu stood quietly at the door, not daring to move. The room was silent. Jiang Xuning couldn't see what the expressions of the people inside would be, and after a long silence, she heard a low and calm voice inside, okay. She couldn't tell what was going on at this moment. The wind blew through the hall, and the pink petals trembled slightly. Jiang Xuning raised her hand slightly, and before stepping away, she silently put the small branch of apricot blossom on the edge of the window. Jianshu couldn't help but be stunned. After Zhang Xuning left, he first put down the lacquer plate holding the medicine bowl next to him, took the apricot blossom on the window edge, returned to the house, and presented it to Xiawei. He leaned back on the couch under the window. Zhou Qiwang's medical skills are undoubtedly exquisite, and after a few days of cultivation, the wound has gradually healed, except for the paleness of his face. He has reduced some weight, and it looks not much different from the past. Jianshu whispered, Fang Xiaining's second girl is resting on the edge of the window. Xiawei stretched out his hand to take it. There are still fresh creases left at the broken stems of the twig apricot blossoms, and the pink and white petals of the first bloom are particularly delicate and tender in the north, where the last winter is almost early spring, and even incredible. Where do the apricot blossoms bloom so early? At that moment, he looked at the powder on the branch, and felt that his heart seemed to dissolve, and there was a trance like a dream after getting what he wanted, but the smile on his lips added a bit of deep quiet and peaceful warmth. With his eyes wandering, Xie looked out the door. The sun is setting in the west, and the surroundings are quiet. Jianshu didn't dare to be disturbed, and after waiting for him to retract his gaze, he asked softly, what the first girl said, my subordinates let Dayakan do it. Xiawei nodded. Jianshu bowed and wanted to retreat, but halfway back, Fang remembered something and stopped, as if he hesitated. Xiawei looked at him. Jianshu hesitated for a moment and asked, what second missing means is to catch a live one and lock him up to prevent him from causing trouble. But if... Xiawei's eyebrows raised slightly, and the light of his eyes that fell on the small branch of apricot blossom never raised for half a minute, and he didn't care about Zhou Yanzi, so he only said lightly, then catch a dead one.